Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, Tamás. I'm really very grateful to you and to Anna for having brought me here. It's always an honor to be able to present one's ideas, but much more important is what you learn from everybody else. And this is such an intelligent and articulate and interesting group that I'm having a great time. I'm going to start by explaining why the title of my presentation that you see is different from what's in the program. I started off with this idea that let's explore this notion of being truly multipolar in cultural terms, and I changed my mind as I was going along because this is an idea that has actually been around for a long time, and I'm just going to share with you some ideas of the really visionary French sociologist Edgar Morin, who in 1990, in his book, which was called Penser l'Europe, said it all already. And although Morin's ideas were premonitory, they were ahead of their time, I have a real sense that Europeans have come around to the idea of multipolarity in two senses. The first sense is that since obviously European powers no longer dominate the world in colonialist terms, the conditions of exchange and relationships have changed, but also the idea that Europe has to be part of the multipolar, because you had a bipolar, which was the Soviet Union and the United States. Then you had, for a couple of years, a unipolar. It was only the United States. Then you had maybe bipolar coming back with China. Then you got BRICS. And in all of this, Europe is part of that multipolar. It's one of the poles, but I think it would be very delusionary for Europe to think that when you talk about multipolar, it means Europe and the rest, because Europe is only just one of those poles. But I won't dwell on that point. Just to underline perhaps the last sentence in Morin's selection of ideas here, Europe can become a locus of reflection and innovation for the establishment or restoration of true conviviality. And the true conviviality that he's talking about is, of course, global conviviality. And I'm coming to this assignment for this morning both as Tamás has kindly said, a scholar, but also a scholar who's been very closely involved in policy advocacy work. So scholars who are involved in policy advocacy work are considered with sometimes with a certain amount of, what's the word I'm looking for? They're not considered as serious. So there are several of us who are here, including Philip Schlesinger, and he knows what I'm talking about. But the point I'm trying to make is that these remarks are really kind of, I have to distance myself, to use a term that was used by Anna yesterday, from both of those stances and try and find a sensible common ground. And so the first 2 or 3 slides I'm going to share with you are really slides that are ideas that come from the domain of scholarship. And the first idea I want to share with you is that there is a great deal of blurring of boundaries, almost confusion in the way that many institutions, many people, many analysts talk about cultural diplomacy. And I think it's very important to make a distinction, and this is a distinction that was made by a scholar called Richard Arndt, between cultural relations that consist of processes of cultural exchange and cooperation that grow naturally and organically without governmental intervention, and cultural diplomacy, which is something that takes place when formal diplomats serving national governments or supranational governments try to shape and channel this natural flow to advance national interests, and you transpose to the level of the Union, of course. And the importance of talking about this distinction and the need to perhaps respect it comes back to what Tully was sharing with us yesterday about the power of concepts and the need to get away from, if you can, from the ambiguity, to reduce the ambiguity in the use of concepts. And in this regard, I'll go on to the next slide. What one can observe in relation to these two terms in the usages of the Union is that cultural diplomacy is not exactly a term that's favored. In fact, if you look at the communication, it only figures 4 times, twice as a title, and then the other 2 times sort of in passing. The really favored term is cultural relations, or international cultural relations. And it's clear that in the way the institutions and the leaders, the thought leaders of this process in the EU think, they have much more cultural relations in mind. And in the process, they are also tending more and more to use this term cultural diplomacy, which has become fashionable, together with another term, soft power, which has also become very fashionable. And I just want to share with you a very recent citation from a very recent interview with the inventor of the term soft power, Joseph Nye, where he said, "As the term came to be more broadly used, it was also often misused to mean anything other than military power, rather than my definition of it as getting what you want through attraction and persuasion, rather than coercion and payment. With time, I have come to realize that concepts such as soft power are like children. As an academic or a public intellectual, you can love and discipline them when they are young, but as they grow, they wander off and make new company, both good and bad. There is not much you can do about it, even if you were present at the creation." So we're in that kind of a situation in relation to the words, the terms that are used. The second point there is that because of this emphasis on cultural relations, some of you will remember the work of the American political scientist Robert Kagan. Americans are from Mars, Europeans are from Venus. And so what he was referring to is a stance in international relations that is much more idealistic, let's say, and values-driven on the part of the Europeans. The Americans are much more interest-driven. And the third point has already come out in some of the discussions yesterday, is that there is a continuing grappling with a conundrum. What is European identity? What are we talking about when we know how very sensitive and jealous member states are about national sovereignty around cultural matters? Tamás, you spoke about this preparatory action that I had the privilege to lead a couple of years ago. It was called Engaging the World Towards Global Cultural Citizenship. And I've selected from that work a few of the key ideas just to see how those key ideas have been picked up in the work that has gone on since then. And the first key set of ideas about European responsibilities, the responsibility to share our achievements and qualities with the rest of the world in a spirit of mutual learning and reciprocity, is something that does come out very strongly in the communication. What doesn't perhaps come out so strongly, something very odd has happened in the transfer of this slide to the screen, but basically it's around this notion of the multipolar. Thank you. Because of the multipolarity and because of technological change and the nature of contemporary communications, the very conditions in which these processes play out have changed considerably. Because it's difficult to read, I'm not going to dwell on it. The report also dwelt on a certain number of axiological principles, principles of value, and it seems to me that those principles are also well reflected. Where there is less of a fit is in a whole series of principles of method. And perhaps at this point, I should just go back and say something that I should have said right at the outset, that this preparatory action was actually led by a number of institutions, entities. One of them was IFA, and Sebastian Köber of IFA is sitting opposite me, and another one of them was CARE Consulting, and Philippe Kern is with us as well. There were the British Council, Goethe Institute, Institut Français, other actors. So, in terms of the principles of method that were recommended as a result of 18 months of research and inquiry, both within Europe and in a number of what we call third countries, there were these ideas that came out. I think you've had enough time to look at those 4 principles that are up there on the screen. And I think perhaps the key one there is this idea of co-creation and co-curation as being that kind of collaborative effort is really the bedrock of lasting ties. And again, that's not really cultural diplomacy. That is the pursuit of cultural relations in the deepest sense. If I can continue to another series of ideas, build on existing good practices, complement some, reshape others, forge new instruments, mechanisms, and initiatives, combine European commonalities with European diversities. You see some of that coming out in the work that has gone on since then and in the communication. Another set of principles that the group thought would be very important are the 4 that you have in front of you. Be more effective transnationally without creating new layers of bureaucracy. Seek coherence and synergies among tools and instruments, and we saw yesterday how difficult that can be, not just as regards tools and instruments, but as regards the entities that are in play in this field. Take transparent and participative decisions, and coming back, that's the same point, bring clarity to the role that you expect different institutional players to play. We did think that it was very important to have a strong coordination mechanism within EEAS to do this. One, there is no such mechanism, that hasn't been created. Stronger presence on the ground across the world. Possibly entrust a coordinating role to an independent body such as UNIC, but as you were telling me just a moment ago, Silvia Costa, UNIC is the big players, and Europe has many countries who don't have cultural institutes. So that also immediately presents a problem of an issue of balance. And as an alternative to that, we suggested perhaps what you want to do is staff certain delegations with culturally competent personnel. The last set of preconditions, I think, is these 4 points. I'm just checking. Yes, that's what it is. No, there is another one to come. Adequate funding, of course. A smart pooling of resources. Work on barriers to mobility, which is a bit of an aporia nowadays with all of the security and other concerns. If anything, mobility with the rest of the world is decreased and will continue to decrease. More support to civil society actors. That is something that is very powerful rhetorically, but we see much less of that in practice. For all politicians now, it's good politics to say we want to work with civil society, but when you get to the bottom line, it's not always what happens. And the last issue is one that many of us are very concerned about, is that the serious monitoring and evaluation. And finally, it seemed to us, and this is also a point that came out very strongly at the beginning of yesterday's session, that in order to build these completely different sorts of ties across the world and in many different crisscrossing directions, it's really at the level of young people that you really start. It's an educational challenge. It's in the tools you use and the way people communicate. And in terms of cultural awareness, you need to sow the seeds of that cultural awareness right from the primary school level. And the reason you've got Umberto Eco up there on the screen is not just because we're in Italy, but that was a point that Umberto Eco made very strongly to a group that Romano Prodi had set up when he was the president of the Commission to look at this question of intercultural dialogue. And I was on the sort of secretariat of that group 15 years ago, and the first point that was made by Eco himself was that very one. So, I'll come to, which is really my conclusion here. You have the more general sort of conceptual issues that I addressed at the start. You have this very concrete set of recommendations that were made. Not all of them are necessarily good recommendations, but that's what we have to work with. How much of this agenda has been achieved? Because we're at this moment, as you set out, Anna, in your concept note, that we want to look at what progress has been made and what's the road ahead. So the first point is that the spirit has been willing, quite apparently, but the institutional commitment, I would say, both political and intellectual, has not been as robust as it needed to be. Neither cultural relations nor cultural diplomacy have truly come in from the margins at the level of the European Union. It's not surprising that that should be the case. They haven't come in from the margins anywhere, in any national setting either. Both remain confined to the conventional menu of essentially official options. It's quite clear that you have a tension here, a permanent tension between the fact that soft power is really only exercised effectively by and through civil society actors. You have a tension between that ground reality and the workings of an institution which is essentially governmental. And the last point is really a question. If you go back to the first slide I shared with you, Morin's idea that the originality of what we can provide as Europeans to the rest of the world is to be a locus of reflection and innovation, that's where I leave you with a question mark. Is that really what the European Union is going to be doing, given the aims and programs and actions set out in the communication? Thank you very much.